August 6th, 1945, 8:15 a.m. In an instant, everything changed. A single weapon, dropped from a single aircraft, unleashed a force never before witnessed in human warfare. But the explosion itself was only the beginning. What happened in the 24 hours that followed would be a descent into circumstances that challenged every assumption about human endurance, about the limits of suffering, about what people could survive and what they could not. The stories from those hours are almost impossible to comprehend. The decisions people made, the scenes they witnessed, the reality they suddenly inhabited. This is not about the bomb itself. This is about what came after. When the flash faded and the survivors opened their eyes to a world that no longer made sense. At 8:16 a.m., 1 minute after detonation, Hiroshima existed in a state of complete chaos that no one in the city could yet fully understand. The bomb had exploded approximately 1,900 feet above the city center, creating a blast wave that flattened buildings for miles, followed immediately by thermal radiation that ignited thousands of fires simultaneously. But for those who survived the initial blast, the first minutes were marked not by understanding, but by confusion. Many survivors later described the same phenomenon. They had seen a brilliant flash, brighter than anything imaginable, followed by darkness. Some thought they had gone blind. Others believed night had suddenly fallen. In reality, the darkness came from the massive cloud of dust and debris thrown into the air by the blast, blocking out the sun. Those first moments passed in complete disorientation, people unable to see, unable to hear properly due to the concussive force, unable to understand what had just happened. As the dust began to settle, perhaps 5 or 10 minutes after the explosion, survivors started to perceive their surroundings. What they saw defied comprehension. Buildings that had stood moments before were now rubble. Wooden structures had been blown apart, their fragments scattered across a landscape that looked as though it had been swept clean by some enormous force. Fires were already burning everywhere, small at first, but growing rapidly as they found fuel in the destroyed city. The human cost began to reveal itself in these first minutes. People emerged from the wreckage, but many of them were injured in ways that seemed impossible to the uninjured eye. The thermal radiation from the bomb had traveled at the speed of light, reaching the ground before the blast wave. Anyone in direct line of sight of the explosion who wasn't shielded by buildings or other structures received burns that were unlike anything conventional weapons produced. The pattern of burns often reflected what people had been wearing. Dark clothing absorbed more heat, causing deeper burns in those areas, while lighter clothing provided some protection. Some people bore the shadow patterns of objects that had been between them and the explosion. Their skin burned everywhere, except where something had blocked the thermal radiation. But perhaps most disturbing were the people who appeared uninjured but acted strangely. Some walked as though in a trance, their arms held out in front of them at odd angles. Others moved silently through the chaos, not crying out, not speaking, simply walking. These were people in profound shock, their minds unable to process what had happened, their bodies continuing to function while their consciousness retreated from a reality too terrible to face. The fires were spreading rapidly. Hiroshima had been built largely of wood and paper, materials that ignited easily. The thousands of fires started by the thermal radiation began to merge, creating larger conflagrations. Within 30 minutes of the explosion, distinct fire zones were developing across the city. The wind patterns created by the fires themselves began to affect the spread, drawing in cooler air from the periphery which then heated and rose, creating a convection effect that pulled the fires in certain directions. People who could move began trying to escape the fires. This often meant heading toward the rivers. Hiroshima was built on a delta, with 7 rivers running through it. These rivers would become crucial in the hours ahead, both as escape routes and as gathering places for the injured. But in those first minutes, people weren't thinking strategically about survival. They were simply trying to get away from the immediate dangers they could see: the fires, the collapsing buildings, the spreading destruction. The city's infrastructure had been completely destroyed. There were no functioning fire departments, no organized medical response, no communication systems working. The people of Hiroshima were entirely on their own, each person making individual decisions about survival, with no information, no guidance, no coordination. This absence of any organized response would characterize the entire first 24 hours and would dramatically affect survival rates. By 9 a.m., approximately 45 minutes after the explosion, The scope of the medical catastrophe was becoming apparent to the few medical professionals who had survived. Hiroshima had possessed medical facilities before the bombing: hospitals, clinics, trained doctors and nurses. The explosion had destroyed or severely damaged all major medical facilities. Most were located in the city center and had taken the full force of the blast. Dr. Terufumi Sasaki was one of the few doctors to survive relatively uninjured. He had been at the Red Cross hospital when the bomb detonated. The hospital was far enough from the hypocenter, and the building's construction was sturdy enough that parts of it remained standing. Dr. Sasaki found himself faced with a situation no medical training could have prepared him for. Thousands of injured people began arriving at the hospital within the first hour. They came on foot, were carried by others, or simply appeared and collapsed. The nature of the injuries overwhelmed standard medical approaches. Burns covered vast portions of people's bodies. The pattern of these burns was unlike anything from conventional weapons. People had been burned primarily on the surfaces facing the explosion. Someone standing in profile to the blast might have one entire side of their body burned while the other side was relatively unaffected. The depth of the burns varied tremendously. Some people had superficial burns that were nevertheless excruciatingly painful. Others had burns that penetrated deep into tissue, destroying skin, muscle, and in some cases exposing bone. But burns were only part of the medical crisis. Many people had been struck by flying debris. Glass from shattered windows had become thousands of projectiles, embedding in skin and flesh. Wood splinters from destroyed buildings acted as shrapnel. Pieces of metal from destroyed structures had been accelerated to high velocities by the blast wave. People arrived at medical facilities with debris lodged in their bodies, some of it visible, some hidden beneath clothing or skin. Then, there were the crush injuries. Buildings had collapsed on people. Heavy beams had fallen, trapping victims. Those who escaped being crushed outright often had broken bones, internal injuries, and damaged organs. The medical facilities that remained operational had no X-ray capability, no way to assess internal damage beyond physical examination. Doctors had to make decisions based on external symptoms alone, trying to prioritize who could be saved and who was beyond help. The medical personnel themselves were traumatized and often injured. Nurses worked with their own wounds bandaged. Doctors treated patients despite broken bones or burns of their own. The supplies were grossly inadequate. Bandages ran out within hours. Morphine and other pain medications were depleted almost immediately. Sterilization was impossible with no running water and no functioning utilities. Doctors found themselves performing procedures with no anesthesia, no proper tools, no ability to prevent infection. Dr. Sasaki later described working for 30 straight hours without rest. He moved from patient to patient, making rapid assessments, providing what minimal care he could, then moving on. There was no time for proper treatment. The sheer number of wounded made individual attention impossible. The best that could be done was to clean wounds superficially, apply whatever bandages were available, and move to the next person. For many patients, this minimal intervention was the only medical care they would receive. The psychological impact on medical personnel was profound. They were forced to make decisions about who to treat and who to leave untreated. With resources so limited and the number of injured so vast, triage became brutally simple. Those who seemed likely to survive with minimal intervention received attention. Those who appeared to be dying received nothing. The medical staff had to walk past people begging for help, had to ignore cries of pain, had to focus only on those they might save while leaving others to die. This created moral wounds that would affect survivors for the rest of their lives. By noon, approximately 4 hours after the explosion, medical facilities were completely overwhelmed. They stopped accepting new patients because there was simply no space and no supplies. People were lying in hallways, in courtyards, in any available space. Many were receiving no treatment at all, simply lying where they had been placed, waiting for help that would never come. The lack of water was becoming a critical issue. Injured people were desperately thirsty, both from shock and from their injuries. But there was no clean water available, and what water could be found was contaminated with ash and debris. The 7 rivers running through Hiroshima had seemed like salvation to people fleeing the fires. By mid-morning, thousands of people had made their way to the riverbanks, seeking refuge from the flames that were consuming the city. The rivers offered the promise of cooling relief for burns, water to drink for the desperately thirsty, and escape routes away from the destruction. But the rivers would become one of the most tragic aspects of the first 24 hours. People entered the water in massive numbers. Those with severe burns felt immediate relief as the cool water covered their damaged skin. The pain of burns is intense and unrelenting, and the water provided the first respite many had felt since the explosion. People waded in, submerged themselves, floated in the current. For many, this relief was the last sensation they would experience. The water appeared to accelerate the dying process for the severely injured. People who seemed relatively functional when they entered the water would suddenly weaken and drown. Bodies began accumulating in the rivers within the first hours. Some floated downstream, carried by the current. Others became trapped against bridges, debris, or riverbanks. As the day progressed, the number of bodies in the water increased dramatically. The tides affected the rivers, causing water levels to rise and fall. When the tide went out, bodies that had been floating were left on exposed riverbanks and mudflats. When the tide came back in, it would lift bodies that had been resting on the banks, creating a grotesque cycle of rising and falling corpses. Survivors who had taken refuge on riverbanks found themselves surrounded by the dead, unable to escape without entering water that now contained countless bodies. People continued entering the water throughout the day, despite the growing number of corpses. The pain of burns was simply too intense to resist the promise of relief. Those who were not yet dying would wade into the water, sometimes having to push past floating bodies to do so, desperate for any reduction in their suffering. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. People were forced to choose between enduring unbearable pain and entering water that had clearly become dangerous and was filled with the dead and dying. Some people spent the entire first day in the water, standing in the shallows or clinging to riverbank structures. They were too injured to leave, but not yet dying. They watched as others around them weakened and drowned. They saw the bodies accumulate. They witnessed the tide's effect on the dead, and they remained because leaving meant returning to a city that was burning, to heat and fires and no medical care. The river, despite its horrors, seemed like the better option. Children were particularly affected by the rivers. Many had been separated from their parents in the chaos of the explosion and its aftermath. They made their way to the rivers alone, following the crowds, seeking relief from burns, or simply seeking water to drink. Small bodies accumulated along the riverbanks and in the shallows. Some children died alone. Others died in groups, clustered together as though seeking comfort in their final moments. The sight of these children would haunt survivors for decades. The bridges crossing the rivers became gathering points, but they also became obstacles. Debris blocked some bridges, making passage difficult or impossible. Bodies accumulated against bridge supports, creating grim barriers in the water. Some bridges had partially collapsed, creating dangerous conditions for people trying to cross. Yet people continued attempting to use the bridges, trying to escape certain areas of the city, or seeking specific destinations, family homes, schools, meeting points that had been established for emergencies. By evening, approximately 12 hours after the explosion, the rivers were choked with bodies. Estimates vary, but thousands of people died in the water during that first day. The exact number will never be known. Many bodies were washed out to sea by the tides and currents. Others would remain in the rivers for days or weeks, creating public health hazards that would complicate recovery efforts. The rivers, which had been seen as sources of life and escape, had become mass graves that continued to claim victims throughout the entire first 24 hours. While people struggled in the rivers and medical facilities were overwhelmed with injured, the fires that had started immediately after the explosion were developing into something far more dangerous. By late morning, individual fires had merged into massive conflagrations. The fires were creating their own weather patterns, generating winds that fed more oxygen to the flames and spread burning embers to new areas. A firestorm is a specific meteorological phenomenon where fire becomes self-sustaining and self-propagating through the creation of powerful convection currents. Hot air from the fires rises rapidly, creating a low-pressure area at ground level. Cooler air rushes in from the periphery to fill this void, and this incoming air is immediately heated by the fires, causing it to rise as well. This creates a cycle that generates extremely powerful winds directed inward toward the fire center. In Hiroshima, this phenomenon developed throughout the morning and reached its peak in the early afternoon. Winds of hurricane force were being generated by the fires themselves, pulling debris and even people toward the flames. The temperature in the fire zone became extreme, hot enough to ignite materials that wouldn't normally burn. Metal twisted and melted. Stone cracked from thermal stress. Anything combustible was consumed almost instantly. People who had survived the initial blast and had avoided the worst injuries now faced a new threat. The firestorm was advancing across the city, consuming everything in its path. Escape routes that had existed in the morning were cut off by afternoon. People found themselves trapped between walls of fire, with limited options for survival. Some attempted to run through the flames, hoping to reach safety on the other side. Few succeeded. The heat was too intense, the flames too widespread. The firestorm created some of the most nightmarish scenes of the entire 24-hour period. People could see the flames approaching, but were unable to escape due to injuries, debris blocking their path, or simply because there was nowhere to go that wasn't also burning. They would wait as the fire drew closer, hoping it would somehow miss them, knowing it almost certainly would not. When the flames reached them, death came quickly, but not instantaneously. The heat alone was enough to cause severe injuries before the flames actually touched skin. Others sought shelter in concrete structures, believing these would provide protection from the fire. Some of these structures did survive the firestorm, but the people inside often did not. The buildings became ovens, the heat inside rising to lethal temperatures. Even though the structure itself didn't burn, people died from heat exposure, from lack of oxygen as the fires consumed all available air, from carbon monoxide poisoning as partial combustion occurred in oxygen-depleted environments. Bodies found in these structures after the fires had passed were often relatively unmarked externally, but had died from these invisible causes. The firestorm lasted for several hours, reaching its peak intensity around 2 p.m., approximately 6 hours after the initial explosion. During this period, most remaining wooden structures in the central city were consumed. The fire essentially completed the destruction that the blast had started. Areas that had sustained only moderate damage from the explosion were now completely destroyed by fire. The combination of blast and fire created a zone of near-total devastation, extending for over a mile from the hypocenter. By late afternoon, the firestorm was beginning to subside, not because it was extinguished, but because it had run out of fuel. There was simply nothing left to burn in the central city. The fires continued in outlying areas, but the intense convection currents weakened as the core of the firestorm consumed itself. Winds died down. The sky, which had been darkened by smoke for hours, began to clear slightly. What remained was a landscape of ash and rubble, still smoldering, with small fires continuing to burn in isolated pockets. The psychological impact of the firestorm on survivors was profound. Many had spent hours watching the approaching flames, believing they were about to die, only to have the fire somehow bypass them through luck or chance. Others had watched from across rivers as the firestorm consumed areas where their families had been, knowing that anyone in those zones could not have survived. The firestorm had created a clear demarcation between life and death, based on location alone. Being on one side of a particular street meant survival, while being on the other side meant incineration. In the early afternoon, approximately 4 to 6 hours after the explosion, a strange phenomenon occurred. It began to rain. But this was unlike any rain the survivors had ever experienced. The drops were large, heavy, and black. They left dark stains on skin and clothing. The rain was oily, thick, with an unpleasant odor. This black rain fell for approximately 30 minutes in certain areas of the city, primarily northwest of the hypocenter. The black rain was a mixture of radioactive fallout, ash from the fires, and water vapor that had been drawn up into the massive mushroom cloud and then precipitated out as the cloud cooled. The raindrops were large because they had formed around particles of debris in the cloud, creating heavy drops that fell quickly rather than dispersing as mist or light rain. Many survivors saw the rain as a blessing. They were desperately thirsty, having been without water for hours. The fires had created intense heat that added to dehydration. Injured people in particular were suffering from fluid loss due to burns and blood loss. When rain began falling, people opened their mouths to catch it. They collected it in containers. They used it to wet cloth to place on burns. Some people bathed in it, believing it would help clean their wounds. The rain was contaminated with radioactive materials, particularly radioactive iodine and cesium. Ingesting this water exposed people to internal radiation, which would contribute to later illness and death. But in the moment, survivors had no way of knowing this. The rain appeared to be normal precipitation, perhaps darkened by soot from the fires, but otherwise harmless. The fact that it was radioactive would not become clear for days or weeks. The areas where the black rain fell most heavily would later show higher rates of radiation-related illness among survivors. But during that first day, the rain seemed like one of the few positive events since the explosion. It dampened some of the fires. It provided moisture to the desperately thirsty. It cooled overheated skin. The negative effects would come later, invisible and insidious. But in those immediate hours, the rain seemed beneficial. Some people noticed that the rain caused skin irritation, or that it tasted strange. A few refused to drink it or use it, relying on instinct that something was wrong. But most survivors were too desperate to be cautious. When you're suffering from severe burns, covered in dust and debris, dying of thirst, and suddenly rain falls, caution gives way to immediate need. The human body in extremis prioritizes immediate survival over potential future consequences. The black rain also contributed to contamination of the rivers. It fell across a wide area, and much of it eventually flowed into the water system. The rivers that were already choked with bodies now also contained radioactive contamination from the rain. People drinking from the rivers or using river water to clean wounds were exposing themselves to radiation without knowing it. The long-term health consequences of this contamination would affect survivors for decades. As darkness approached on August 6th, the city of Hiroshima entered a new phase of horror. The fires provided illumination, creating a hellish landscape of flickering orange light and deep shadows. The temperature dropped as night fell, which brought relief from the daytime heat, but also created new problems for survivors. Many were exposed to the elements with inadequate clothing, burns that required protection, and no shelter. The sounds of the city at night were perhaps even more disturbing than what people could see. Darkness hid some of the visual horror, but it amplified sound. Calls for help echoed through the ruins. People trapped under collapsed buildings, who had been calling all day, continued crying out. The injured who had been silent during the day found their voices in the darkness. Some were calling for family members. Others were simply begging for water. Still others had deteriorated into incoherent moaning or screaming. Medical personnel, and the few organized rescue efforts that had begun during the day, continued working by firelight and moonlight, but effectiveness was severely limited by darkness. It was difficult to assess injuries visually. Navigating through the rubble became more dangerous. The risk of falling into unseen hazards or triggering building collapses increased. Many rescue efforts simply stopped at nightfall, with rescuers planning to resume at dawn. For the injured people lying in medical facilities or on riverbanks or scattered throughout the ruins, night brought a feeling of abandonment. During daylight, there had at least been the possibility of help arriving. In darkness, that hope faded. People lay in pain, unable to see their surroundings clearly, unable to know if help was nearby or if they had been forgotten. The psychological impact of this isolation was severe. Many people who might have survived with intervention lost their will to keep fighting during that first night. Families who had been separated in the chaos of the explosion spent the night searching for each other. People walked through the ruins carrying small lights, calling names, checking faces of the injured and dead. Some searches were successful, resulting in tearful reunions. Many more were not. Parents searched for children. Children searched for parents. Spouses searched for each other. The darkness made these searches difficult and dangerous, but people continued anyway, driven by the hope that their loved ones might still be alive and waiting to be found. The dead were everywhere, but in darkness, the living sometimes couldn't distinguish between the dead and the deeply injured or sleeping. People would come across a body lying still and have to get close enough to check for breathing or a pulse, a grim necessity that had to be repeated hundreds of times for anyone moving through the city. Each check brought the hope that this might be a living person who needed help, and the dread that it would be someone beyond help. Temperature regulation became a critical issue for survivors with severe burns. Burns destroy the skin's ability to control body temperature. During the day, the heat from fires and the sun had kept most people warm despite their injuries. At night, as temperature dropped, People with extensive burns began to suffer from hypothermia. They had no ability to maintain body heat and no intact skin to provide insulation. People who had seemed stable during the day deteriorated rapidly once night fell and temperatures dropped. The lack of clean water continued to be one of the most critical problems. By nightfall, approximately 12 hours after the explosion, most survivors had had nothing to drink for half a day. The human body can survive days without food, but only a few days without water, and that's for healthy individuals. For people with burns, blood loss, and injuries that caused fluid loss, dehydration became life-threatening much more quickly. Some people died during that first night simply from dehydration, their injuries not immediately fatal, but their bodies unable to function without water. Perhaps the most commonly reported phenomenon from survivors about that first night was the silence. Despite all the suffering, despite the tens of thousands of injured and dying people, large areas of the city were remarkably quiet. This silence came from shock and trauma. People were too injured, too exhausted, too traumatized to make noise. They lay where they were, conserving what little energy remained, waiting for something to change. This silence was broken occasionally by sudden outbursts. Someone would begin screaming, a high-pitched sound that would continue for minutes before stopping abruptly. Others would call out suddenly, asking for help or calling for family members, then fall silent again. These intermittent sounds made the overall quiet even more disturbing. The contrast between silence and sudden noise created an atmosphere of tension and dread. Medical personnel working through the night reported that the silence was one of the hardest things to endure. In normal medical situations, injured people vocalize. They cry out in pain. They call for help. They communicate their distress. But in Hiroshima that night, most of the injured were silent. They lay with eyes open, aware and conscious but not speaking. This made assessment difficult. Doctors couldn't tell who was in immediate distress and who was stable. The silence masked the severity of conditions, leading to situations where people who needed immediate intervention were overlooked, while people who appeared worse but were more stable received attention. The silence also affected the survivors psychologically. Normal human reactions to disaster involve communication, coordination, reaching out to others, but the scale of the devastation and the depth of the trauma had pushed many survivors beyond the point where normal social behaviors functioned. They had retreated inward, focusing solely on their own survival, unable to extend concern or assistance to others. This created a strange atomization where people were physically close but psychologically isolated. Some survivors later described feeling guilty about their silence during that first night. They had lain near others who needed help, but had not offered assistance. They had heard calls for water but had not responded. They had witnessed people dying, but had done nothing. This guilt would haunt them, even though their behavior was entirely understandable given the circumstances. When you are traumatized and injured yourself, when the scale of disaster is beyond comprehension, when you lack any resources to help others, silence and inaction become the default response. Children were particularly affected by the trauma-induced silence. Many had become separated from parents and were alone in the ruins. Some had injuries that should have caused crying and calling out, but they sat or lay quietly, too shocked to vocalize, their young minds unable to process what had happened. Rescuers moving through the ruins would sometimes stumble upon children sitting alone in the darkness, making no sound, staring at nothing. These children had to be physically checked because they gave no indication of their condition through sound or movement. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate Hiroshima on August 7th, the full scope of the devastation became visible in ways it had not been the day before. The fires had largely burned out overnight, leaving a landscape of ash and twisted metal. The morning light revealed the true extent of the destruction. For miles in every direction from the hypocenter, virtually nothing remained standing. The city had been erased. The temperature change from night to morning brought new medical crises. People whose body temperature had dropped during the night now faced rising temperatures as the sun came up. Injured people who had survived the night were often weaker, having lost more blood and fluid, having spent hours without food or water. The dawn of the second day saw many deaths among people who had survived the first 24 hours, but whose bodies could no longer compensate for their injuries. Organized rescue efforts began to increase with daylight. Military personnel who had been stationed outside the city when the bomb fell had been mobilizing throughout the night. By dawn, They were entering the city in organized units, bringing supplies and medical personnel. But what they found overwhelmed their capacity to respond. The number of injured was beyond anything they had prepared for. The supplies they brought were immediately depleted. The scale of the disaster required resources that didn't exist. Communication with the outside world had been severely limited during the first 24 hours. Most communications infrastructure had been destroyed. The few radio transmitters that remained operational had been broadcasting basic information about a catastrophic attack, but details were sparse. As dawn broke on August 7th, more information began to flow out of Hiroshima to the rest of Japan and eventually to the world. But in those first 24 hours, the people of Hiroshima had been largely cut off, dealing with apocalyptic conditions while the rest of the world remained largely unaware of what was happening. Survivors who had spent the night in place began to move with the morning light. Some were seeking medical attention they hadn't been able to find in darkness. Others were resuming searches for family members. Still others were simply leaving the city, walking away from the devastation toward outlying areas where conditions might be better. These movements created streams of refugees leaving Hiroshima, carrying with them stories of what had happened, spreading word of the catastrophe to surrounding areas. The true death toll from the first 24 hours would never be precisely known. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people died on August 6th and the early hours of August 7th. This represented approximately 1/3 of Hiroshima's population. Another third were injured, many of whom would die in the coming days and weeks. The remaining third had either escaped serious injury through luck or had been outside the city when the bomb fell. The radiation effects were not yet apparent. People who had received lethal doses of radiation on August 6th would not show symptoms for days or even weeks. They appeared relatively uninjured during that first 24 hours, functioning normally, helping others, making plans for recovery. But the damage had been done at the cellular level. These people were already dying. They just didn't know it yet. This created a false impression of survival rates that would be corrected tragically as radiation sickness began to manifest in the coming weeks. As the 24th hour after the explosion passed, Hiroshima remained a city in crisis. The immediate catastrophe of the blast and fires had passed, but the suffering continued. Medical facilities remained overwhelmed. Food and water were critically scarce. Thousands of bodies remained where they had fallen, creating health hazards and psychological trauma for survivors who had to live among the dead. The city faced not just recovery, but survival, day by day, as those who had lived through the first 24 hours fought to live through the next 24. The bombing of Hiroshima and its aftermath represented a new type of warfare, one where a single weapon could destroy an entire city in an instant and condemn tens of thousands to prolonged suffering. The first 24 hours after the explosion were a concentrated experience of human suffering on a scale rarely matched in history. Those who survived would carry the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Those who died in those first hours, from blast, fire, injury, or drowning in the rivers, experienced the immediate consequences of nuclear war. The world would learn the lessons of Hiroshima slowly, over years and decades. But for the people in the city during those first 24 hours, the lesson was immediate and visceral. They learned what it meant when technology outpaced humanity's ability to control it, when weapons became so destructive that the concepts of victory and defeat became meaningless in the face of absolute devastation. They learned these lessons not through study, but through experience, through hours of suffering that would mark them forever. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.